warm welcome to the book talk on women in leadership in the European Union. A particular welcome to the authors of the book today, Professor Henriette Müller and Professor Ingeborg Tömmel. My name is Etienne Basso, and I am Director of the Members Research Service in the European Parliament. I would like also to welcome, of course, our audience online this afternoon. Women and leadership in the EU is our topic today. We had, as everyone knows, recently big personal changes in the EU leadership. For the first time, President of the European Parliament, the President of the European Commission, and the Governor of the European Central Bank, to name only a few of the most important institutions, are women. Also, if we look at the evolution of the presence of women in parliaments, and I refer to publication of the EPRS about participation of women in the parliament, we see that there is an increasing trend over time, where we are reaching now about 40% of participation of women in the European Parliament. So this is very important, but it shouldn't hide the fact that we have also still a long way to go. If we look at the presidents of the European Parliament, Simone Veil was elected in 1979. We had to wait 20 years for Nicole Fontaine to be elected in 1999, another 22 years until Roberta Metsola was elected also president of the European Parliament. So we see that there is still a long way to go. But beyond figure, and I think this is the important aspect of the discussion we are going to have today, is to look at what is the substantive difference in female and male leadership. And the book that is going to be presented today is very interesting because it gathers from academic perspective EU studies, leadership studies, and gender studies into a coherent analytical approach. So I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. I'd like also to refer to another publication of the EPRS that you find online. I have your paper copy, which is Women in Politics in the EU, State of Play, and it looks at the gender gap, wide gender balance in political matters, and so on and so on, and it also looks at various obstacles. So the conversation today between the two book authors will be chaired by Gabi Umbar. Gabi Umbar is non-resident fellow at the EPRS. She's also a professor at the EUI in Florence. So we are very much in your hands for this conversation today, Gabi. And thank you again for taking the time. Thank you to the authors for being with us today, and over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Etienne, for the introduction, and a warm welcome to all of you. I'm very happy today, not only because we have the editors of the book with us, but we are entering a topic that is actually an everyday, all day, lebensweltlich, as Habermas would have said, reality of the biggest share of the European population. So just for the formal introduction of the speakers, please allow me to introduce the editors and our discussant, whom I very much thank that all of you could make it today. Henriette Müller is Assistant Professor of Gender Governance and Society at the New York University, Abu Dhabi, and has a strong focus on aspects of gender, governance, leadership, and a comparative focus on the European Union and the Arab Gulf countries. Ingeborg Tömmel is an emeritus professor of the University of Osnabrück, where she had a chair on international relations and EU politics, and the Jean Monnet chair. And her focus was very much on everything around the European Union, so political system implementation studies, but also very strongly focusing on leadership, political leadership. Both authors in their own research have focused and previously published on female leadership. And political leadership in general. Adding to our panel, we are very much thankful for him to have joined, although it's a very special day for the Republic of Italy. Thank you very much, Michelangelo, for that. Is Michelangelo Vercesi, who's a researcher at the Portuguese Institute of International Relations at Universidade Nova de Lisboa. And his research focus is also very much focusing on leadership. He extends that to political parties and parliaments, political elites, and leadership and comparative governance. So to lay the ground a bit, I want to extend on what Etienne started to provide a bit of context through numbers, because what we are talking about today is not only a very interesting study in European integration studies, but it is a fundamental pattern of our societies. So the EU population 2022 was composed of 446.7 million people, roundabout. Out of those, 228.4 million people were female. So we have a share of 51.13% female population within the EU. Etienne, you already alluded to that. 3 out of the 7 EU institutions have female leaderships. If we count the European Economic and Social Committee and the Committee of Regions in, it's 4 to 5. So pretty good share, actually. Members of European Parliament, you said that, round about 40%. If we trigger down the multi-level system of the EU, the pattern becomes a bit less favored. So still good in terms of historical trajectory. But if we look, for example, into the national members of parliament, we are at around about 36.3%. National governments, presidents and prime ministers, 22.2%. Senior ministers, 32.8%. Regional executives, prime ministers and head of governments, 13.9%. Members of governance, 36%. So we see what we have in the long-term development, and that's important to underline, a constant improvement of female participation and representation. We have, as compared to the 51.13% of EU population, an underrepresentation in decision-making, because we hover around about 30%, 1/3, 30, 36, 39%. I guess all of us could, from anecdotal evidence or gut feeling, provide educated guesses about why this is the case. Stereotypes, gender roles, social policies that lag behind providing equal participation opportunities for women and caretakers of society, economic policies, gender pay gap. But what is important, and what we will hear about today, is actually to look into the empirics about that, to look into the qualitative part of the narrative that we are talking about. And Etienne, you very much so underlined that. So what we will listen to is the account of 2 editors who embarked on something that is indeed overdue, systematic, and a wonderful addition to European integration studies. In their co-edited book, Women and Leadership in the European Union, Henriette and Ingeborg focus on bringing 3 parts of European integration studies together: the gender, the leadership, and the overall view on the institutions. They do that in a book that covers a lot of ground. So we look into a systematic common framework for analysis for gendering leadership in European integration studies. But we also look at a very rich corpus of empirical studies on the EU institutions, various chapters on the European Commission, on the European Parliament, High Representative. We do have the Court of Justice, the ECB, but we also dive into female leadership across institutions with a case study on Viviane Reding, for example. Finally, adding to that is the member states' perspective to female leaders of the recent past, Angela Merkel and Theresa May, but also looking into the public administrations to see how is actually the underbelly of the political system performing if we look into female leadership. Henriette and Ingeborg, with that short introduction into the quantitative assessment and into the hopefully qualitative, not so bad results, I hand over to you for your initial presentation to make us understand why you felt it was time to edit this book and what the book contributes to the discussion of European studies. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gabi. Thank you so much, Etienne, for this wonderful and kind introduction. It is really an honor and a pleasure for Ingeborg and me to be here today. So we are very excited about this book talk, about the presentation, and in particular the discussion afterwards also with the audience. And we would also very much like to thank Mika Angelo Vecchesi for having agreed to discuss our book. So thank you so much. Let me share my screen, I would suggest. So we have prepared a couple of slides that we would like to share with the audience as well. And then we can delve right into the book Women and Leadership in the European Union. And also, as it has already been pointed out, and we would like to stress this very much again, it is an edited volume. It has been a collaborative adventure, so to speak, and a collaborative research project. We are very, very grateful to the contributors of the book. Without them, this whole project would not have been possible. We brought together more than 20 scholars from across Europe, the United States and Canada to really delve into this kind of world of women and leadership. And as has already been addressed by Etienne as well as Gabi, it really brings together new research avenues, these three disciplines of gender studies, leadership studies, and EU studies. And so far, there has always been a lot of research, of course, on the intersection of gender studies and EU studies, as well as EU studies and leadership studies. But to bring them together, this is kind of the novel approach in a sense, but at the same time also an invitation for new research. It's like we consider it as a starting point, so to speak, and it meant for each contributor also to move a little bit out of the comfort zone, so to speak, to explore something new. Yeah, so also as a background of how this project came about. So in this book, we aim to answer three main research questions. So what have been the specific opportunities and challenges for women in accessing top-level positions in the EU? How do women exercise leadership and with what impact? And to what extent, if any, do women practice different leadership styles than men or from men? And as was pointed out before, of course, we move across all the different institutions. So we want to cover all the main EU institutions. We want to bring all the different scholars together. So we needed to develop, of course, a conceptual framework, an umbrella that would make this actually possible. And so this is our conceptual framework, where we have on the one hand a distinction between positional leadership and behavioral leadership, and on the other a distinction of different EU offices. So with regard to positional leadership, we are concerned with the underrepresentation of women, where we look in particular into the hurdles and constraints on their pathways to leadership, so the ascendance to leadership, such as institutional structural constraints to access leadership positions, such as gender-based stereotypes or the allocation of portfolios, high prestigious portfolios perhaps versus low prestigious portfolios. Then we also look into specific situational contexts, such as leadership in uncertain or vulnerable circumstances. And you might have heard already of the so-called glass cliff metaphor in this regard, that means basically a window of opportunity for women to step in times of crisis, but it also indicates higher risks of, for example, failure with regard to leadership. Yeah, so to look into that. With regard to behavioral leadership, we look into the exercise of leadership, and this is then concerned with patterns of performance, styles, rhetoric, as well as with achievements. And on the other hand, we distinguish between different types of EU offices, political positions, as we all know, EU commissioners, for example, council members or MEPs. Administrative positions are, for example, the Secretary General of the European Commission or Directors General. And then we also have expert positions, such as the ECB governors or judges of the European Court of Justice. And this distinction, of course, is important because these different types of offices indicate different pathways to leadership and therefore potentially also different hurdles, different structural constraints. And also with regard to the exercise of leadership, these different offices indicate different functions and therefore might also yield into different patterns of performance or styles, etc., that might be important. And so bringing this together, let's have a look of how we applied basically this to the book. Here it's just a shortened table of contents. As you can see, under conceptual approaches, we have, of course, the framework that we just pointed out, but also we look into European integration theory and how gender and agency has been addressed in those or not. Yeah, so what are the gaps actually that also Gabi already pointed out. And then also with regard to accessing positional leadership, leadership in EU institutions. We have here in-depth chapters that look into the EU Commission as well as the European Parliament. From there, we move on to political leadership and how it's exercised, as was pointed out before with regard to Viviane Reding, but also the high representatives of the European Union, as well as female vice presidents of the European Commission, and also delving deeply actually into the European Parliament and different types of offices and what this means in terms of ascendance and exercise of leadership. We also turn around the perspective and look at national leaders in European arenas, here with regard to Angela Merkel and Theresa May. And then we have two sections that look in depth into exercising administrative leadership, and we will provide also a glimpse into the research on Catherine Day today. And then also with regard to the Court of Justice of the European Union and the European Central Bank. And the last chapter then provides an appraisal of Ursula von der Leyen during roughly her first year in office. So this is just at a glance, the book. And it also has an appendix for those who might be interested. It provides an overview of all women leaders across the institutions listed here from 1979 until 2021 across all the institutions, just to provide kind of a comprehensive picture. Now, moving on from there to the main results, and here we would like to start with positional leadership again. And I just wanted to share this graph with you, and it builds off of what already Gabi Umbach pointed out with regard to the increase of women leaders across EU institutions. The dark gray, so these are stacked bars, as you can see. The dark gray refers to the European Parliament, and then all the way up, the light gray is the Court of Justice. But more interesting are, of course, the colored lines. And they show, as was pointed out before, this general trend of improvement. But at the same time, if we zoom in, of course, we see more of a staccato development, always also with setbacks, as well as also huge variations across the EU institutions. And this is also, it's only a small graph that points out only the increase of women leaders. It doesn't look into the male counterparts for the sake of time, basically. But nonetheless, what we can see from this graph is that the ascendance into leadership positions for women has been laid and at different paces across EU institutions, usually with the European Parliament being more on the front line with regard of higher representation of female MEPs. But when we look into the leadership positions, also for the European Parliament, presidents, vice presidents, or committee chairs, we also see continued underrepresentation or a divergence between so-called feminine and masculine portfolios as well. The Commission has been also delayed and has increased more recently, also due to the push of the European Parliament. And the intergovernmental level, here we observe the most kind of severe underrepresentation or continued underrepresentation of women. And while for the ECB and the Court of Justice has been also relatively closed, so the expert positions have been relatively closed as well, but there has been a leap forward also in recent years. So overall, we observe huge variations across EU institutions, member states, and also an underrepresentation in more prestigious portfolios. And we can relate this to severe selection processes, continued intense public and professional scrutiny, and also to a varying degree, indeed, the windows of opportunities, the so-called transformational situations that open this window of opportunity, also, of course, with a certain risk. But we also would like to point out that the EU also provides specific opportunities for accessing leadership positions, such as where party competition plays a minor role, or that the EP strongly lobbied for gender equality across EU institutions, and also that more recently EU institutions increasingly pursue equality and inclusion policies within their own organizational structure. So this is also, we observe this for the European Central Bank, of course, also for the Commission, so that's also important to note. And now I would like to hand it over to Ingeborg to give us a more detailed overview of 3 case studies. Please, Ingeborg.
Thank you, Henriette. In our book, we analyze a variety of individual women leaders, but here we have chosen to present 3 cases of top women leaders, namely Ursula von der Leyen as President of the European Commission, Catherine Day, who has served as Secretary General of the European Commission, and Christine Lagarde, who serves as president of the European Central Bank. And these three stay also for the distinction that we made between political, administrative, and expert leadership. So looking now at their pathway to leadership, first Ursula von der Leyen, she progressively moved to higher offices. She exclusively held political offices. She had a very late start at about 40. This is quite typical for women, that they can start only late. But what is exceptional about Ursula von der Leyen is that she had, at this late age, such a steep career. Ursula von der Leyen moved from a feminine ministry in the beginning, so-called feminine, that was the Ministry of Family, Women and Youth and so on. But she soon moved to more so-called masculine portfolios, in particular the Ministry of Defense. She was 2 times in a pioneer position, that means the first woman in the office. That was already when she became Minister of Defense, and obviously when she became the first president of the European Commission. Looking at Catherine Day, she also moved progressively to higher offices within the Commission administration. That means she held exclusively administrative office, but it's also normal in this case. She predominantly held so-called masculine policy areas and portfolios, as for example competition policy, industrial policy, and also foreign policy. And she was a pioneer when she acceded the position of Secretary General of the European Commission. Ascended to. Looking now at Christine Lagarde, she also progressively moved to higher offices, but her career was rather mixed. She moved from the private sector via political offices to finally expert offices, and this is again quite exceptional, that someone really moves between these 3 domains so easily, I would say. So an exceptional career path. She held exclusively masculine positions and responsibilities, and she was 4 times a pioneer in the respective positions. That means she was the first woman head of high-level committees in her law firm. She was the first Minister of Economics and Finance in France. She was the first managing director of the IMF, and finally she was the first woman to president of the ECB. Yeah, thank you. I pass again to Henriette.
Yes, so moving on now to the main results for behavioral leadership. And here I would like to kick it off basically with a comparison of female vice presidents of the European Commission. Yeah, here, and this is taken from a chapter, from chapter 7 that I've co-authored together with Pamela Pansardi from the University of Pavia. And here we look into 6 female vice presidents of the European Commission, and we analyze their speeches and compare them to all the male counterparts, so male commissioners, male vice presidents, and the presidents up until 2019, analyzing their rhetorical skillfulness at the example of charismatic rhetoric. And this is based on sociolinguistic research, scholars such as Judith Baxter found that women tend to engage more than men in complex forms of impression management due to a double bind to preempt negative evaluation. And we were curious to what extent this also applies to the European Commission, to the EU institutions, and here at the example of the female vice presidents. And what we were able to find is indeed that female VPs and commissioners show the highest level of charismatic speech making, so the highest level of rhetorical skillfulness, providing both authoritativeness and relatability with regard to catering to the audience as well as providing vision. And men and women use both socially constructed feminine and masculine norms of public speech making, so moving across the binary or the dichotomy basically, but women tend to make a stronger use of the variance of speech patterns, so tending to cater more strongly to different audiences. And we relate this back to the severe constraints that they have been experiencing on their path to leadership, And so those who make it to the very top tend to be also highly skilled or highly prolific leaders. He is studied really only at the example of rhetorical skillfulness. And so this is a glimpse into this chapter, and I would like now to hand it over again to Ingeborg. Thank you very much.
Yes, thanks, Henriette. We turn now to behavioral leadership, and with that to our 3 cases, which we earlier presented, looking at their careers. So we'll now examine the behavioral leadership, that is the performance in the respective offices that they held. First, we have to look what functions do they have in these offices. In the case von der Leyen, this is mainly agenda setting and launching the Commission proposals, but she has also the role of building compromises when dealing with the other EU institutions who have to take the respective decisions, particularly the European Council, where she is also a member of. Then Catherine Day, she engages as well in agenda setting, as her task is mainly to prepare the Commission proposals, but she also engages in compromise building, both internally within the Commission between the political and the administrative level, but also externally in regard to the decision-making bodies, the Council and the EP. Finally, Christine Lagarde, her main function is decision-making in European monetary policy via the instruments of the European Central Bank, and this is a very difficult task, as every observer can see. Looking now at the performance of these 3 women leaders, first the leadership style. Von der Leyen acts always quite assertive. She is resolute, but she can also be very conciliatory when it comes to building compromises and to bring about a decision. For Catherine Day, we can also conclude she is very assertive, but she's also cooperative, as she has to coordinate many different actors to get a Commission proposal ready for decision making. Then finally, Christine Lagarde, she's also highly assertive, but she can also be inclusive and collegial, particularly in regard to the Board of Governors of the ECB, which consists of the delegates of the central banks of the member states. And this is a difficult group, and so it's very important to be, in fact, also collegial and soft, I would say. Looking now at the communication style of our 3 leaders, von der Leyen excels always with a pointed rhetoric and clear positioning. Catherine Day is more mediative, as she has to coordinate many institutions and actors. And Lagarde, again, practices clear positioning, but she has also a strong public outreach. She gives lots of interviews because she wants to explain the policy of the European Central Bank to the wider public, and this is something which distinguishes her very clearly from her predecessors, who did not engage in such things, far not as much. Now, looking at the major achievements of these 3 women, von der Leyen succeeded in expanding the role of the European Commission, and with this also the Union as a whole. And this was already visible in her first year in office, when she managed successfully a European common policy in face of the COVID-19 crisis, and when she set up the European the Recovery and Resilience Facility. Yeah, the names change very quickly in the European context, so it's really something difficult at some moment. But you know, the facility, the big fund which has to be to compensate for the economic losses of the COVID-19 crisis in the member states. So Catherine Day, she succeeded in positioning the Secretary General at the center of the Commission, and that means particularly at the interface of the political and the administrative level, and that in turn meant that she succeeded in improving significantly the quality of Commission proposals, as these proposals were much better coordinated internally than before. Finally, Lagarde, she successfully navigates the EU's monetary policy, especially now in the difficult situation of rising inflation. And we all can observe that she is exposed to enormous pressures from outside, from various actors and stakeholders in this regard. And she, up till now, has really perfectly managed this situation. Okay, next slide, please. Yes, so what are the main results of our book on the issue of women's behavioral leadership? First, we can conclude women in top-level offices of the EU perform extremely well, and this applies not only through for the 3 cases that we presented, but for quite a lot of other women leaders that we analyzed in this book. Second, successful women leaders practice a multidimensional leadership style, and that is a style which combines the so-called feminine and masculine norms of leadership. Third, women leaders are not per se the better leaders, but they are more subject to severe selection processes and public scrutiny, and that means, at least for the time being, those women who pass these processes are in general higher qualified, better performing than on average their male counterparts. And fourth, a multidimensional leadership style fits particularly well with the political system of the EU, because this system needs both proactive pushing forward the development and the policies of the EU, and at the same time building compromises and consensus in an atmosphere with many leaders and many actors and many stakeholders. Then our next theme is which lessons can we draw from our research, or have we drawn from our research? First, all EU institutions should improve their equality and inclusion policies in both the leadership and middle management positions. These institutions have already such policies, but I think there is still room for improving them further, we think. Then second, the EP should continue to lobby for more multidimensional leadership, for more women in top offices across the EU institutions. The EP was very successful already in the past to practice this, but we think it should continue, even though we have now some more top-level leaders than before. The third conclusion is, or third lesson, in selection procedures for top offices, a multidimensional leadership style should be considered an asset for all candidates, men and women alike, because there are also men who practice these 2 styles, and we have already seen that also these men are more successful. That is not within the book, but we have done other research on men, so we can draw this lesson also. And fourth, as the EU political system demands complex processes of consensus building, it is particularly conducive to multi-dimensional forms of leadership, and we would add it's perhaps for this reason that the EU has recently quite a lot of top-level leaders, women leaders in its system. That's our lessons. So thank you very much for your attention, and we look forward to the comments of our colleague Michelangelo Vercesi.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks to the 2 editors for giving us a parcours through your analysis, not from the start, from the overall framework of analysis towards the main results. One short notice, Wolfram Kaiser already makes good use of that. Please enter in the chat your questions that we will come back to later so that we can pick them up again. Henriette and Ingeborg, that was a very, very interesting first glimpse at leadership and office, leadership and gender, that in the end come up not in a dichotomy of that's female, that's male, that's better, that's not better, although you go into the feminine and masculine types of portfolios and paths, but to understand, oh, there's something coming up here. We are a multi-level system that requires some sort of multidimensionality in leadership. So either or is not really adequate to the system. Michelangelo, if I may, how does that resonate with your studies on political leadership and political elites and the entire field of European integration studies that the book actually really starts shaking? Over to you.
Okay, yeah, so thank you very much. Thank you very much for the clear presentation to Henriette and Ingeborg. And in general, let me thank you, first of all, the organizers of this event. It's a pleasure for me to be here and to discuss this, I would say, great book. I really enjoy the book. So congratulations for the book to the editors and the contributors. And also thank you very much to Professor Gabi Umbach for the kind invitation and to Anne-Cécile Charlier for the organizational support. So I have only a few minutes. You have already presented the main premises and conceptual framework and results of the book. So I will not elaborate on these aspects, but I would rather focus on what, at least in my view, in my opinion, are the main strengths in the context of the existing literature of the book. So I would try to read the book against the literature. And I would I would try to stress where I would like to see advancements for the research. I'm going to refer to three main aspects, issues in this order. First of all, I would like to focus or to discuss the major contribution and the innovative aspect of the book, in my view, of course. Secondly, I want to discuss how, in my view, the book relates to the broader debate about feminist institutionalism, or in other words, the gendered facet of political institutions, because this is a huge debate, a lovely debate, and I wanted to stress this. And then I would focus on the research outlooks that the book indicates, and I have two questions. So of course, I have to also to play my role as a discussant. So I will try also to stress where, in my view, you could elaborate further, starting from this book. Okay, so the first point. I'm not an expert in gender studies as Henriette Ingeborg, but as you said, I'm interested in leadership and political leadership, political elites, and representation in political institutions. And so, first of all, I really liked the comprehensive nature of the book, and also the fact that the book put together top quality scholars and the substantial findings. Beside the fact that the book conflates different strands of the literature, as was said in the introduction, so gender studies, youth studies, and leadership studies, I would like to stress that I really like the fact that the book, with so many contributors and chapters, has a clear, homogeneous conceptual background framework, and so that the readers can refer to this framework when they go deep into the single chapters. And I wanted to stress the twofold focus on positional and behavioral leadership you have presented. Of course, in relation to the different types of leadership, so political, administrative, and expert. Because I liked very much this idea of focusing on both positional and behavioral leadership, because at least this is what I saw thinking of the classic elite studies. This distinction echoes to some extent the classic strategies to measure political power. So which have informed elite studies. On the one hand, you have, looking at those who hold the position, the positional method, and then observing the decision-making process to understand who matters. So I like this. And moreover, a measure plus, I would say, that I see is the possibility through this framework, with your framework, to take the role of agency in due consideration as a something which shapes political outcomes in this regard in the EU, but also within a consideration of the political structure in which political actors are embedded. Because I think that when you study the positional leadership of women, and I mean, this is my interpretation, the positional leadership of women and the different paths that women follow, this can be understood also as from another perspective, as a study of the structure of opportunity that women face, and the opportunities and constraints that a woman or also a man or a LGBTQIA plus person can face when these people decide to enter politics, to climb the ladder, to break the highest glass ceiling. So, for example, if you find that there are gender quotas, these are can be an opportunity. But then, as you said, if you find that there are patterns, regular patterns of allocation of portfolios and responsibility according to this distinction, masculine, feminine, or low prestigious jurisdictions, for example, when you don't have autonomous public spending capacity, okay, this could be a constraint. So I like the fact that you look at this, and I would frame this as the structure of opportunity. But at the same time, when we look at the behavioral leadership of women, so how they lead, how they achieve outputs, outcomes, etc., we are observing the agential impact of women within this structure. And I think that this is very important to understand the actual implications of female leadership or different forms of leadership, because leaders behave within the borders of an opportunity structure. So on the one hand, the focus on agency that you have allows comparing between women and also between comparing the performance of women and men within the structure. And for example, you can with your work, one can see if the structure is more demanding for women when it comes to achieving and exercising power. But so we can also ask ourselves if women perform like men or worse or better than men, although they face more obstacles, or if the obstacles are similar, why, for example, you have different exercise of leadership is due to different political socialization, gender stereotypes also. So in general, I mean, I really like this. And this is just, I mean, not even a suggestion, so just an idea I wanted to put on the table, that you could also frame this distinction as a distinction between structure and agency, and the relationship between agency and structure. And you could also, add a discussion about intersectionality, so within the same structure, to see why there are differences. And this leads to my second point, which concerns how the book is placed within the theoretical and, I would say, also epistemological debate about the gendered nature of political institutions. But just in a nutshell, the thesis is that institutions, both formal institutions like a parliament, a party, or informal, for example, regular expectations about appropriate behaviors or career paths, would implicitly create a different structure of opportunity for people of different genders. So this is the thesis of the gender institution. And in this specific case, of course, women would face more obstacles in their pathway to power, for example, due to the structure of gender relationships in the society. And in my view, I mean, it seems to me that this idea is really corroborated by your findings. From a more general viewpoint, you stress, and I think this is important, that women are not better in themselves. So there's no gender, better gender, but rather that they tend to follow alternative yet successful political strategies and behaviors. And this could be an important indicator that if institutions are gendered, people of different genders adapt in diverse ways, in different ways, following their most rational strategy as defined by the context. So to make it short, if we care about having gender neutral institutions, especially democratic institutions, what should we do to make institutions less gendered? This is a research question, rather. I mean, I don't expect you to answer, but a question for the future, maybe. And here comes my final point, the third point, the implications for the study, of your study for the future, both in scholarly and in practical terms. I have two questions specifically for you as editors. The first one, I mean, the premise of the first one is, okay, against the background of feminist studies and the debate on gender institutions I was referring to, and based on what you have discovered working on the book together with the other contributors, do you think that EU institutions can be fruitfully understood from a scholarly point of view as gender institutions, are gender institutions? And if so, I would like to hear your opinion about where you could move on in the study of this topic based on your results. You have stressed the contribution you provided to the literature, but now what for the research paths do you see that your book opens in light of the literature and your findings? What would you think that it's worth studying? Where do you feel that the literature is insufficient? So, I mean, to summarize the research agenda that you see as fruitful from your book, research outlooks. And secondly, I would say that the basic assumption based on the evidence that also you provide in your introduction and through the book is that there are of course interinstitutional differences, but women have been and still are underrepresented. We have seen this today, and this is of course a major concern of scholars who study the topics that you address in your book, but also is a major concern for many stakeholders and policymakers, the underrepresentation of women. But at the same time, we are all observing that the number of women in leadership position is increasing. You provide evidence for that, although it's still below the ideal benchmarks that we usually agree on. So how do you expect that your conclusions that you have in the book may change in light of the increasing number of women in leading positions, and what are the perspectives in this sense? So in other words, I would say, what could your findings tell us about what we can expect in the near future in terms of democratic representation and inclusion in the EU? So you expect that there is some contagion, and also maybe men who were used to have another style of leadership will adapt. There will be a mixed, as you say, multidimensional style of leadership. So perspectives in this sense. So thank you very much again, and looking forward to discussing.
Great, thank you very much, Michelangelo. I've actually already taken 5 points out of your comment on top of the chat that is getting longer and longer. So first of all, back for initial reactions, Henriette and Ingeborg, to you immediately to what Michelangelo just outlined, and then we will go over to the Q&A.
First of all, many thanks, Michelangelo, for all these very, very good points. And I think there are so many points, it's very difficult to react to all of them, particularly those which are for future research. But I think that is a very a push for us to continue to do studies on this issue. I think this is very, very, very important. Yeah, I think I pick something out of your many comments. You emphasized first the structure of opportunities for women. I think this is really very, very important. Maybe we touched this well in the empirical analysis and also in our final conclusions. We still think that the European Union is a political system that is structured a little bit more favorable for women leaders to ascend to these positions, but we have not researched this in extremely good detail. And I think there are also differences between the EU institutions if you look at the opportunity structures, and I think we may conclude that they are the most difficult in the case of the European Council and the Council, so that means the institutions which are staffed by the member states. But we see also a slightly difficult situation in the European Parliament. We found that where political parties are responsible for selection processes, it's a little bit harder for women to pass, whereas if you look at von der Leyen and also Christine Lagarde, but even Catherine Day, they were selected by superiors in the von der Leyen and Lagarde by the European Council, and in fact I think after the behind the scenes it were mostly President Macron and Chancellor Angela Merkel who proposed at least the selection to the European Council, and I assume, even though this is never made public, that Angela Merkel strongly pushed Ursula von der Leyen and Macron certainly pushed for Christine Lagarde. So I think that makes difference. I think political parties are much more difficult. Sometimes there's more competition, and then in these competitive relationships, women have often more difficulties. And if you look at Catherine Day, she was always promoted by her superiors. If you look at her career, we couldn't present all this material. So I think there's a lot of room to study much more in detail and more thoroughly the structure of opportunities. And I think this is very important to get more insights into also into the future, whether this trend will continue of more women in these offices, or whether we see perhaps a stagnation, or whether the situation was now exceptional and the system returns again to male incumbents. So another point, or you take it over, Henriette? Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Ingeborg. Yeah, maybe just to build up, to pick out one point as well, like with regard to the future and the outlook. So I think what's quite interesting with regard to the combined leadership styles. So Pamela Pansardi and I, we did a follow-up study actually for the European Parliament and the different political groups, looking into the comparison for more gender equal political groups such as the Greens and also the left. And it became apparent in terms of their charismatic rhetoric, for example, that they become more even, more leveled out, so in contrast to the more gender unequal European Commission, and that at the same time political opinion become voiced more independently from each other. So actually these more gender inclusive institutions, in this case like a political group, let's say such as the Greens, also move it forward in terms of different patterns than of performance, comparing across gender. So we can clearly kind of further this as well, right? At the same time, you're absolutely right. It's really a starting point to invite more and new research. A little bit of work has been done also on intersectionality in chapter 9 that looks into the European Parliament, but this is clearly an avenue that needs to be studied much more thoroughly and strongly moving forward. Yeah, so here we would really like to point this as kind of the starting point for a whole new conversation perhaps on that, but I'd like to give it back to Ingeborg in case you'd like to add something. Thank you.
Something on the multidimensional leadership style. I think this multidimensional leadership style is not an invention of women, but again, women are much more scrutinized. If they behave typically like a woman, caring, conciliatory, they don't get to leadership positions. If they do the opposite, and we have a case in the book that was Vivian Reding, she was very much pushing things through and very assertive and less conciliatory. She got a lot of opposition. She got a lot of opposition. She also was not elected when she was a candidate for becoming vice president of the EP. So I think, or we think, that was a little bit, or the author, Michelle Cheney, has elaborated that was a little bit a consequence of her too assertive leadership style for a woman. Men, certainly for a one-sided leadership style, have nothing to fear. But if men practice both these leadership styles, and that is not feminine or masculine, but is assertive and conciliatory, then they are more successful. That is what we found already in some of our studies on men. So I think again for women the situation is more complicated. If I think they can handle career only, or not only, but best if they practice both these styles. Yeah, that's on this point. Should we?
Great. Do you want to? So I see the list of questions are getting longer and longer. It's getting longer and longer. So I would like to bring the audience in, because what the audience does, Michelangelo, is actually taking up 3 points that you made. So you talked about also the question of structure and agency, intersectionality, which is important to look into, the question of gender neutral institutions, how to ? And obviously then male adaptation in terms of democratic representation and inclusion of different groups. And I saw down the chat, down the line, Thomas has linked his questions to that, but please let me start from the very beginning. And Wolfram, while you talked about the path to, Wolfram Kaiser, while you talked about the path to leadership positions, formulated 2 questions that I bring together with Magdalena Zapala's question that follows up. So Wolfram asks, how have you considered socialization, so early socialization and cultural, socioeconomic resources as a factor that can influence women's career paths? So especially with the view on von der Leyen, while she was rather mature already, rather, but in the midst of her professional life, actually she grew up in Brussels. She grew up with a father who was a commission official before he came prime minister in the German land of Lower Saxonia. Also with the type of the economic quintile that she inhabits, seems to have enough socioeconomic resources for supporting her with the childcare of 7 children that she mothered. So if we just look at gender and miss out these socialization and social background, do we get the entire story? This is one part of his question. So the relevance of embedding context socialization for female career paths. Second question is linked to the communication styles. How did you define and measure leadership and communication styles? Discourse analysis, psychological analysis, external perception, interviews, so on the method, how you went about analyzing. And linked to that a bit is Magdalena's question. Do you see any particular differences in female leadership in Europe and the US? So both in terms of style and in terms of how women get to power. I would actually give that back to you before I summarize the next questions.
I start with the socialization and you with the methods, Henriette. Is this okay? Something she does. So about socialization, I can be short. We really examined this for Ursula von der Leyen, and the literature is full of saying something over how she was socialized. I think she was very young when she was in Brussels. I think that made her only very firm in foreign languages. But it's clear that because of the political offices of her father, that she was familiar with political life. And I think the socialization plays always a certain role, but it's never the entire story. So it's always also what an individual makes out of it. whether she or he is, or in this case, she is ambitious, whether she wants to do something, whether she wants to enter politics. And if you look, for example, at Christine Lagarde, we have not done this extensively in the book, but we are proceeding with further studies on her career. She has not a socialization from home in politics, for example, but she was the eldest daughter of a family with 3 younger brothers, and she herself said she knew already at an early age how men behave and act. And I think that was a very good characterizing how socialization. So I think socialization are many individual paths, and very different paths can lead to a leadership position of women, but they are never the entire story. Never. I think there are lots of things, indeed the opportunity structure and lots of contextual factors which play a role, and certainly also the individual ambitions and perspectives that someone has. So Henriette, you want lessons?
Okay, thank you so much for the question also regarding methods and methodologies. So the books cover very different methodologies that reach from quantitative analysis to qualitative comparative analysis or in-depth single case studies. For the chapter on the Commission vice presidents, for example, with regard to the analysis of speeches, we used a quantitative content analysis. We worked with a software called Diction that had to trace, to analyze different tones within language using inbuilt dictionaries. And so we used basically a construct, a variable that's called charisma, that has different sub-variables like catering to the audience or adversity or kind of indicating agency. So that would move across the so-called binary of masculine, feminine, and gender-neutral identifiers within the tone, basically, of speeches. And so to actually be able to capture all the variety of speeches across all commissioners. So this is what we did in this analysis to capture how the tone changes. But for example, in chapter 9, that is authored by Johanna Cantula and Cherry Müller, there they do really in-depth interviews with the European Parliament to trace, so to speak, how leaders are perceived in terms of how they ascend into leadership positions, looking across the different parties, the different types of leadership positions within the European Parliament, from policy leadership to the formal functions, basically. And so to look into that very much in depth, we have also single case studies that look into speeches, biographical background, for example, Vivian Redding, and also interviews with Catherine Day at the example of the chapter by Ingeborg Tömmel. So there's not like one methodological approach, but it really depends also on the author as well as the purpose of the chapter, of what you aim to find out. And it's quite interesting that while we have used actually this variety of methods in the book, nonetheless, these main results you can trace across, and actually they become, through the variety of methods that are employed, much more thorough also, right? Because you have different angles actually to look at it. Yeah, so that's with regard to these points. And I think there was another one with regard to the comparison US and Europe.
Exactly.
Should I address that as well? I mean, we didn't study that in depth, so it's here I would, for example, refer to the work by Donatella Campos, who has actually studied also women and leadership in the media, comparing Hillary Clinton and Ségolène Royal and the presidential campaigns of 2007 and 2008. And what she found is, for example, for media perceptions, that they are in both cases were very hostile, very negative towards them. And even if, like, Ségolène Royal had a more feminine style, perhaps had then difficulties to be portrayed as presidential or sufficiently presidential, in quotation marks, was very negatively evaluated. In comparison, Hillary Clinton, who had this more considered adversarial, perhaps, leadership style or assertive leadership style, was equally negatively evaluated as not being feminine enough. Yeah, so not striking, or would not have struck this balance here sufficiently. Yeah. So this is really based on the research also of Donatella Campos that I would like to emphasize here. But it gives a glimpse of these contestations that we can see both perhaps for Europe as well as for the United States. Yes. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Adding to what you just said about the methodology on the speech analysis, Isabelle Gourieux has asked about that. How did you analyze that? Which I think you have described, but now comes a bit, let's say, meat to the bones. What examples of good lines or quotes would you give, good speeches, where potentially emerging female leaders could understand how to put their focus on strengthening female leadership rhetoric style when they deliver speeches? Are there any to-dos and don'ts that you saw in your analysis?
I mean, for this study, yes, thank you so much for this question. For this study, we did it really from a quantitative level, so moving across all the speeches. So we did not pick individual speeches. I think that's more interesting than perhaps for the chapter on Vivian Reding, where it delves more also into individual speeches and framing. But for our analysis, what we found is this striking a balance across, so to speak, being assertive, on the one hand, setting your agenda very strongly. We see this also, this pointed rhetoric and the example of Ursula von der Leyen, but sometimes it's then also a little bit over the top in a sense. So there are also then contestations surrounding it. We saw this, for example, with the labeling or with regard to the migration pact, for example. Yeah, so this is sometimes not without contestation, but more generally, the clear communication style that brings together a clear vision on the one hand, but also addresses the audience and caters, so it's conciliatory, embracing the audience. And this, I think, are two aspects that became very important, but perhaps Ingeborg has also more to say to these points, to the more qualitative.
Oh, no, I think it's. I think there is no recipe on how a woman should communicate, and I think communication is something very individual. And I think Ursula von der Leyen has a specific style, and Christine Lagarde a completely different style, but also a specific style. And I can only rehearse. I think the combination of being open to the public, conciliatory, and at the same time pose clear positions and explain clearly what you are doing is very well appreciated by the public. In the beginning, there was much criticism on both these office holders, as we remember, and everybody was convinced that they didn't know what to do and that they couldn't communicate, nothing. But now, the same, by the way, also with Annalena Baerbock as foreign minister, and now, since these women are longer in office, these critical voices are much less to be heard. And I think it's also a question, the more women are being in these offices, the more people adapt to the style and they find it not so strange. So Hillary Clinton was the first one who run for president of the US, and also Ségolène Royal was very early a pioneer when she was in the race for president. So I think the more women we have in leadership positions, the more people adapt to such a communication style, which is not only more conciliatory than maybe men, but is also more clear very often than men. Takes a speech which von der Leyen held now in the situation before she went to China. So very clear, very exposed. I think all her predecessors would not have said such things. She doesn't hesitate to put things clear on the table, but at the same time she also says, no, we want to have good relationships with China and this and that and that. So she very well plays on these two strengths, or how you may call.
Great, thank you very much, Ingeborg. Adding to that, Thomas, and that comes back, Michelangelo, to what you said about this gender-neutral approach. What is the multidimensional leadership styles? Thomas asks, how have you? First of all, he congratulates on the book. Great book, and thanks you very much for being here. Obviously, how have you dissociated specific leadership styles, for example, observable behavior, which could be exercised by men and women alike, from leadership exercised by specific groups, men versus women? So, meaning, are there particular patterns that you think are fluid, so are travel across gender, in order to establish such a gender-neutral leadership or a multidimensional leadership? And potentially he assumes that causes for styles might be determined by phases of the evolution of EU institutions. For example, the Commission or the ECB in financial crisis. So in how far do times of pressuring times for European integration have an impact on leadership styles across gender, or have you seen particularly women leaders reacting different to crisis than male leaders did? Whoever wants to come in on that first.
Okay, I think it's not possible to make such differences that women react very differently to crisis than men or something like this. I think every leader has to react to the situational context where he or she acts in. So that's the first question. So longitudinal comparisons are very difficult because indeed the European Union is a political system which very quickly developed and evolved and changed its structure. And so I think such a longitudinal study is very difficult to do, particularly for Commission presidents, and more difficult even for the ECB because it's a much shorter life of existence. So again, if you compare the three men which were the presidents of the ECB, they had all three a completely different style. So I think we have maybe to distinguish between these individual reactions on a situational context and also the institutional structure. So the opportunity structure which the institutions offer or do not offer, and the political context, and there are many factors playing a role, and and the individual traits which the incumbents bring with them into office. I think these are also quite different among men, different among women if there are more leaders in the same position. And I think it's very difficult to distinguish that. So we focus more on more general leadership styles and not on very individual styles. Because I think you have to separate the very individual styles from a more general style, and this more general style is a combination of what was regarded always as a female leadership style in the literature, and what was more regarded as a male leadership style, and more so also in the public perception. Because I think there are lots of prejudices in the public that women have to be female, and if they are female, they are weak and they are not good leaders. And I think in face of these situations, we can say, and we have found also in the past men having both these leadership styles. So men can also be very charming, conciliatory. Look, for example, at Jean-Claude Juncker when he went to the United States to talk with Trump about what is it? About releasing all these structural constraints on European exports. So he was very charming, and he flattered Trump, and Trump was very flattered, felt very flattered, and made concessions, which he earlier would not have made. So I think men have also these possibilities, but not all men up till now, because what is called a male leadership style was always seen as sufficient for an office. And maybe in the future this will no longer be seen as sufficient, particularly for office in the European Commission, where you have a consensus style also. Yeah. I don't know whether I really answered the question very well, but
maybe just a very small additional note to what Ingeborg has already pointed out, like with regard to the study on the vice presidents of the European Commission, when we zoom in to the 6 women leaders, basically, on the individual level, their charismatic rhetoric is very strongly different. Yeah, so it's only kind of on the average level, if you compare them as groups, that you see they turn out to be the strongest in terms of their rhetorical skillfulness. But when you zoom into the individual level, they all have their own preferred style at the same time. Yeah, so that confirms also with regard to charisma or charismatic rhetoric that it is, as Ingeborg pointed out before, also at the same time individual and highly strongly individual. And so to strike a balance perhaps between the two as well. Yeah, thank you. Just a minor note.
Great, thank you very much. And on zooming out, as you said that, we have actually 2 zooming out questions. One is from Magdalena Zapala. 3 main skills that these women that you analyzed have in common and that were important for their career. What would that be? So 3 main skills. And Otilia Dragomir says, congratulations on the book. And she was wondering if the authors of the chapters also looked into the geographical dimension. So if there is, and she especially refers to that, some sort of West-East division in terms of leadership styles women display in across the different types, political, expert leadership and administrative leadership that you have analyzed.
Okay, so then I start with the skills. Yeah, the 3 main skills. I would say again, they are all 3 both assertive and at the same time also sometimes even humble. I think they don't make themselves the greatest person in the world, and but at the same time they have quite a lot of skills. So I think in these 3 cases which we presented, Ursula von der Leyen, much knowledge on political processes, and Catherine Day is reported to have lots of skills in many different portfolios of the Commission. So that was very important for her to be the Secretary General, because then she has to bring together all these portfolios into. She had also to prioritize what does the Commission first propose. So she had to mediate between the proposals of different things, and then you must have the knowledge of the whole organization. And again, Christine Lagarde, her skills, I mean, these 3 are different cases because they were different types of leadership, but she, although she is a lawyer by education, she built up enormous skills in economic and financial affairs. So she was already in her first office in a law firm. She was dealing with economic questions. So I think it's the skills are also of all the 3 to develop their skills, with every position that they held. So, for example, again, Ursula von der Leyen in the Ministry of Defense. She was the first woman in this ministry. And that is a ministry which is really male, because we have very few soldiers in the army in Germany, few women aspiring for jobs there. So you are really completely in a male environment, and you have to do with many issues which are more often the interest of men. But she performed quite well, contrary to what is said about her role there. And she was nominated for a 2nd term, which no one of her predecessors was ever nominated for a 2nd term in the Ministry of Defense in Germany. So I think all these women were learning women if I can say it, express it like this. So they really developed more and more skills with promoting to the higher offices, and that's what they really distinguishes them. Perhaps we have not researched this now for different men, so a comparison would be worthwhile. But I think that is, and maybe women on average, but that is something which we didn't research, are maybe also more open for learning things in the course of their life. But that's, I say, only privately. That's not a research result.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't study that, or we didn't look into East-West or North-South divides specifically. But I think if we look across the women leaders, in terms of whether it's the comparative study on the vice presidents of the European Commission, where we also have Kristalina Georgieva, right, Loyola Di Palacio, Margot Wallström, Vivian Reding, Nelly Cruz. So we see actually already that perhaps these challenges and contestations that we observe in terms of ascendance and then also later on performance seem to move across as well, this, so to speak, geographical boundaries or regional groupings, let's say. But it's clearly something that needs to be studied more in depth. For the study here, we saw that they were all in this rank performing higher than the other individual groups that we studied. Yeah, but it's certainly, like, coming back also to Michelangelo's point, it's something for future research actually to build off on and to study more in depth. Yeah, so thank you very much for the point.
Yeah, thanks a lot. We have one question left that I leave for later, because I actually also wanted to come back to Michelangelo. Michelangelo, if you, so with what we've heard and what you've read obviously in the book and what we've heard so far, how does that resonate with your own studies on political leadership? Do you see major differences in female leadership styles and paths, or do you think that there are more the attributes rather than gendered, but attributes that are stronger in female leaders than in male leaders, as we said, assertion or types of collegial style? How does that resonate with your research?
Yes, thank you for the question. I mean, this is a very interesting question. Leadership studies for years have been used to be, of course, without a gender focus, also because women were not part of the leadership. I mean, I'm referring basically to chief executives, because I study chief executives. So I mean, the first one we know in Europe was Margaret Thatcher in the EU, and then so for long there was not that much of presence of women. So for long they have not been interested in that. At one point, there was a new interest in studying women, but rather than on the leadership, the focus was on how they achieve power, because it was clear that there was some kind of harder path to power. And nowadays, I mean, I would follow up to what Ingeborg was saying. There's no actually, I mean, the more women enter, and the more we don't have a clear standard of what is male or feminine. Leadership was used to be considered as with some features because there were men, but then it has become more complex, diverse, internally diverse. Maybe also because women bringing other perspectives became leaders, but also men are changing. If you think Trudeau or Barack Obama compared to others. And so I think that it's not only an issue of women and men, but we are observing the emergence of a more diverse style of leaderships also within groups, and men and men, women and women, along party divisions, or there are many other future, also geographical differences. So I think that the borders are becoming more blurred, I would say, and this is observed in leadership studies.
So representing something that also the book speaks to, this multidimensional leadership style.
Exactly, no single standard anymore.
Yeah, and as also influenced potentially by the fact that our societies become more and more diverse, and more groups want to be catered to also in terms of their leaders.
Exactly.
I have two questions that go a bit into this direction, and I'm bringing that to all the three of you for the concluding panel. So Johanna Breuer says actually that her question relates to women who are, and that it goes a bit into the changes of society, Michelangelo, that you alluded to, women who are not furthering gender equality. How do we deal with or conceptualize these anti-gender equality women who are in leadership positions? How have you included such examples in your book to the two editors, and to you, Michelangelo? Then after Ingeborg and Henriette, the question: have you these anti-positions to positions that potentially could have been coined previously gender positions in both genders, male and female leaders? If what your position on that is. But first, Henriette and Ingeborg, to you the question, if you have analyzed that.
Henriette, or?
Yeah, no, go ahead, Ingeborg. Please go ahead.
No, I think we have not systematically researched this question, but this is an important question too. I think we should have a closer look, because I think, for example, I think Ursula von der Leyen was very much promoted by Angela Merkel already within the German context, but finally also for becoming Commission President. Angela Merkel could not make this openly because she had earlier promised to give support to Manfred Weber. For example, Christine Lagarde said in an interview she was never helped by women in her career, but she doesn't criticize this. So I think there are quite a lot of patterns, and indeed women very often have to face that other women hamper them, or women in leadership positions do not promote women. But those three which we presented, we had first even this in our table, but we thought it is too long. So Ursula von der Leyen promotes women in leadership positions. She tries to, or she was very hard in asking to the member states to send female commissioners. More than her predecessors, even though Juncker also did this already. But she also had already in Germany, but also at the European level, she favors policies which improve the position of women. Catherine Day is naturally, she was in another position, but I heard in the interviews of her female collaborators that she was the best superior they ever had for them. And she also tried to promote more women in higher offices in the European Commission. And Christine Lagarde is explicit. She calls herself a feminist, and she says a woman should have many more positions in leadership positions because they are the better leaders. She is quite explicit, and she doesn't shy away from expressing this, because if women express this openly, they get also a lot of ressentiments. But Christine Lagarde at that moment is already beyond the stage, so she can permit herself to be so openly. Whereas Angela Merkel was never openly promoting women, but behind the scenes she did so, because she also wanted to have, for example, Kramp-Karrenbauer as her successor. But when Kramp-Karrenbauer failed to unite all these different factions in the Christian Democratic Party, Merkel was silent. She didn't support her anymore. So I think there are quite a lot of differences there, and I think it would be highly interesting to do a research on this issue in more detail, but we haven't done it in more detail. We just can say, draw some preliminary conclusions from what we did.
Yeah, maybe just to I know we're out of time, very briefly to build off on that. I mean, I'm not sure whether the question actually moves more toward, for example, far-right women leaders such as Marine Le Pen. And so we didn't study her in particular. I mean, this is also a very contested question, right? Is it a matter of women's empowerment to have women actually in these far-right parties where misogyny is very high? I mean, in the study on the European Parliament that Pamela Pansari and I did, we found that she was very strongly charismatic, actually, because perhaps also of the very strongly contested environment that she's in, both in terms of representation as well as also of misogyny, basically outspoken anti-women policies that she supports herself. And more generally, when we look at the women that we studied, and also as Ingeborg already pointed out, there's also a generational change. Yes, in the past decades, perhaps for women leaders in top positions to be very open about promoting other women's or women policies or equality policies was more perhaps contested as well. That might have been also a reason why Angela Merkel navigated that very differently. And so now we observe also a different performance perhaps with regard to more recent case study or generational change. It might be something in terms of context of time to consider as well, but I want to keep it short, so I stop here. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Michelangelo.
Yes. Okay, so I have only a few minutes to. Well,
We actually have one last question that we will take, so please.
Okay. I would not assume, I mean, that of course, I mean, we already, I think, agree that women and men are not monolithic groups. So of course, there are women with different views about the role of women in the society. Some are more gender equal oriented and others not. And the main same, I mean, you can have a man who is a feminist, and you can have a woman who advocates the traditional division of roles. So, I mean, of course, there's no women and men about that. And also, if I remember correctly, there's a study of 2015 by Diane O'Brien and colleagues about women promoting or not other women. And they found actually that some women promoted less than men other women, because since the opportunity structure is so difficult for women, when you don't want another challenger, something like this. And actually, I am working together with Pamela Pansardi on an article comparing cabinets in Europe led by women to see differences in promotion and allocation of portfolios, to understand which factors beyond, of course, personal attitudes can explain variations. But sorry, so I would really pay attention in thinking the effect of women in terms of substantive representation, so in terms of policy, because this really depends on also the ideological orientation. But it is important, I would say, of course, for the descriptive representation, because you have a woman, so the representation increases. But in terms of symbolic representation, I mean, because it is an indicator that whatever your idea, the classic traditional divide between public male responsibilities and female private responsibility is no longer there. So you can have Giorgia Meloni in Italy, you can have Sanna Marin in Finland, but in both, and the differences are huge in terms of their approach in terms of gender equality. But they indicate that you can get it. I mean, in terms of symbolic representation, I think that this is the most important thing.
Thank you very much. Actually, and we have a last question just came in from Mira Nanini Tiwari on exactly that, what you said. So societal benefits of female leadership. And with that, we really conclude now. And sorry for a bit of the overtime, but it's such a rich discussion and necessary discussion. So I want to bring that in still. In your academic research and experience of the political activities, how do you see the evolution of the balance between foregrounding women's voices to represent their realities and viewpoints, and gender equality, women's participation as an issue that is relevant and of interest also for men. You said that, you just, Michelangelo alluded to that, this symbolic part. So is female leadership really about different topics, or is that about representing how our society changes? How would you assess that in the year 2023 to all of the three of you? Michelangelo, maybe you start this time so that the editors have the last word. And given that exactly that's what you just alluded to in your last reply.
Yes, I mean, my view is that the things are becoming much more complex from this point of view. That you said also earlier that societies are more complex. So the more we get, of course, first you have to break the glass ceiling. And we were referring to Ségolène Royal, and she was not portrayed as a presidential candidate because she had a different style. But once you break the glass ceiling, so this is the crucial moment. I think that then we cannot really refer to the differences between women and men, and it really depends. So the symbolic part is the most important one because you understand that you can get it, and then within the groups you have different views, ideological views, and different approaches. So I think that the most important part is to break the glass ceiling, and so that the whole society, also men, can be affected by that, because you get used and say, okay, it's not that strange that, and this is valid not only for women but for all groups, other identities.
Great, thank you very much. Henriette, Ingeborg, your final words, concluding words on that.
Henriette, now you.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have pointed that out also during the discussion. I think it became very much apparent that in terms of representation, the societies are changing, and also with regard to conceptualizations of leadership and its manifestations, that it also naturally seems to be changing over time. It becomes more perhaps gender inclusive in conceptualization, but also catering to the complexity of political systems. And so we see this manifestation basically evolving polities, basically political systems that really adhere to that. So coming back to the point that we made on multidimensional leadership styles and how this fits very strongly or caters to the, in this case, the political system of the European Union. But of course, when we look more broadly, when we look to Jacinda Ardern and New Zealand, for example, or also, as was pointed out actually by Michelangelo with regard to Canada, Justin Trudeau, for example, we can observe actually moving across genders, of course, that also leadership styles are changing, and like conceptualizations of what is considered good leadership, for example, and how is this then manifested across different systems, the EU system, but also national political systems, for example. Yeah, I would suggest I stop here to give it over to Ingeborg. Thank you.
Yeah, I think everything about this issue has been said now. I don't want to add anything, but yeah, I think things are changing, and things will change more quickly when more women access leadership positions. But I think what Henriette emphasized already, and also Michelangelo, I think things are also very much changing for men. And it depends naturally also on electorates. I think what perhaps the most extreme case, for example, Trump is presenting himself as a very strong traditional leader, that very well pleases certain strata in a society which are perhaps also a little bit more backward looking. But I think in Western democracies, I think more multidimensional leadership style will win in the longer run for both women and men. And I think men are also reorientating their style. I think that's quite clear. look, for example, at Robert Habeck in our.
He was circling my mind too all the time.
Yeah, exactly. So I think this is precisely the type who embraces also the so-called feminine traits and the masculine traits. So he knows what he wants to do, and he promotes things, but she explains also quite a lot, and she looks whether the public is really following him or not.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Ingeborg. Thank you for this assessment. And to all the two editors, Henriette and Ingeborg, thank you very much for presenting the book. Michelangelo, thank you very much for your comment and additional input into this discussion of leadership. And as the main takeaway, maybe to understand that obviously this gendered perspective is still important to conceptualize patterns, but to understand that this is not to fortify or petrify any type of dichotomy, but to understand how we can then come to a multidimensional perspective of leadership that represents our societies in their diversity as we have reached them. And therefore, I can only invite everyone to take a look into the book, because it's really interesting. The annexes alone with the lists of female leadership is a resource that you have difficulties in regenerating in a week, I can tell you. So in terms of the resource and the work that went into that, congratulations again, and thank you very much. I have the pleasure to point at an event tomorrow, 50 years of EU enlargement, same time, same place. And led by Wolfram Kaiser this time, and to stay tuned for our next book talks. And again, a warm thank you to the editors and the discussant. Thank you very much, and see you soon again. Thanks a lot.